Legacy Precious Metals is the company that I trust to give you good and patient counsel for investing in your retirement. The Biden administration has caused a financial crisis, and they have no clue how to fix it. Oil prices have skyrocketed, and when oil prices go up, not only do your expenses go up, but the cost of transportation and shipping spikes, leading the prices of goods to rise. And we are already seeing record inflation. That's the last thing that we need. Our economy is in trouble, and you need to take steps to protect yourself. If all your money is tied up in stocks, bonds, and traditional markets, you may be vulnerable. So gold is one of the very best ways to protect your retirement. No matter what happens, you own your own gold. It's real, it's physical, and it's always been valuable since the dawn of time. Call Legacy Precious Metals today at 866-528-1903 or visit them online at legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com, where you can download the free investor's guide. You can also go to my Facebook page, Jenna Ellis. I am a public figure on Facebook, and I just posted yesterday a really great interview with the president of Legacy Precious Metals, who is discussing why you need to start your retirement account even if you're in your 20s or 30s. There is always a great time to protect your retirement and invest, just like you want to protect your health over the long term. So go to Legacy Precious Metals at legacypminvestments.com or call 866-528-1903.
As a constitutional law attorney, former senior legal advisor, and personal counsel to President Donald J. Trump, Jenna Ellis believes in the rule of law and the importance of integrity in our elections. And she's ready to tackle the big cultural and legal issues facing America. This is the Jenna Ellis Show. Here is your host, Jenna Ellis.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Jenna Ellis Show. I'm Jenna Ellis, and I am so excited and privileged to have my good friend Meg Basham join today. She, of course, is a reporter for the Daily Wire, and if you're not following Megan, you absolutely need to, because she is a critical voice right now for not only conservatives, but actually shining a light on the truth of what is going on behind the scenes in Big Eva, or the greater swath of the evangelical community, and pastors who aren't necessarily preaching the gospel of Christ and have other alignments. And so just this week, she wrote a great article that is titled "How Church Leaders Aligned with Fauci to Discredit Experts Opposed to COVID Mandates." So Megan, thanks so much for joining me. And this is such an incredibly important topic as we look back over the scope of what happened in 2020 and the whole COVID narrative. And now what we're finding out is actually the truth about what they, of course, wanted to call misinformation. So talk about your article and why this was so timely.
Hey, Jenna. Well, thanks for having me. It's really good to be here again. And I think we've sort of entered this period where we're now sort of totally through the pandemic, and we're starting to look back, and there's some accounting happening of how people behaved. And so earlier last week, I had done a lot of reporting on former NIH director, that's National Institutes of Health director, Francis Collins. And if you're not familiar with him, he is quite the bureaucrat. He is held out as a Christian figure, a Daniel in the halls of power. So the most important and powerful medical bureaucrat in government. And he had done a lot of things that wouldn't typically align with Christian principles. Some of those things involved record level spending coming from his department on fetal tissue research. He funded the kind of experiments where we saw fetal ears grafted onto lab rats. So it's really actually fairly gruesome stuff. Also a lot of research involving giving trans hormones to children, minors, mastectomy to girls as young as, it's been a while since I reported on this, but it was at least 12 and maybe as young as 8. And so it was quite the expose at the time. This was back in February when people were getting to know that this Francis Collins, who had been platformed on all of these Christian websites, interviews, podcasts, was not who they thought he was. So he went on to do interviews with people like editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, Russell Moore. He did an interview with Tim Keller. He did one with Rick Warren. And in all of these interviews, the point was to promote following government COVID policies. And that included things like wear your mask, abide by lockdowns, close your churches, make sure your kids are masked, get vaccinated, no questions asked, all of that kind of thing. And he also used these outlets to help him tamp down on what he called conspiracy theories. And one of the conspiracy theories at the time was that this wild idea that the virus might have come out of a Wuhan lab. At the time, you had people at Christianity Today calling that a conspiracy theory. Well, of course, now we know that it's not only possible, it's pretty likely that that's what happened. So fast forward now some months, and there is an organization that Francis Collins founded called BioLogos. And it was founded in 2007, ostensibly to build bridges between Christians and the scientific community, because the concern Francis Collins and his colleagues said was that people don't view Christians as being scientifically minded, and he wanted to change that. Some of the things they believe would be very curious to Orthodox Christians. Things like they don't believe there was an actual Adam and Eve. They believe Adam and Eve evolved from some sort of hominids, but they still call themselves Christians, even though I have some big questions about if you don't think there's a literal Adam and Eve, what that does to your theology. But leaving that aside, it has now come out that BioLogos put out this statement. At the time, it came out, I believe it was in October of 2020, called Love Your Neighbor, Get the Shot. And in this statement, they had a few things that they asked people who signed it to pledge. And these people would pledge to fight misinformation from non-consensus sources, so non-consensus scientists, to pledge to get vaccinated because vaccines are a gift from God, and this particular vaccine is a gift from God, so we should get vaccinated. The third one was to wear your mask because masks are not taking your freedom away. It's a way to love your neighbor. So the big one for me in this report was that they pledged to not only help suppress misinformation, but promote good information. And they specifically named the good information coming from Anthony Fauci. And they said, we should believe, because we believe in Jesus Christ, and this is the literal language of this document, we should believe Anthony Fauci and suppress misinformation and COVID conspiracies coming from these non-consensus scientists and promote consensus science. So we should believe the government science. And so the people who signed this included some pretty big names like theologian N.T. Wright, VeggieTales creator Phil Vischer, our favorite pundit David French, some seminary heads. I'm very sorry to say because I am a fan, but author Philip Yancey, Lisa Sharon Harper. So a lot of big names in evangelicalism signed this document. And that was really the crux of my reporting, was that this kind of flew under the radar. It went even one step further than platforming Francis Collins. It was now making a pledge to suppress really sound scientific voices because Collins and Fauci asked them to.
Wow. And this is explosive because there is a lot of accountability that's finally happening years later and after the fact. But as you're describing this, Megan, and as I read the piece, which is excellent reporting per the usual, and you know what you are becoming very known for, which I love and respect, is that their definition of consensus science, meaning whatever the government narrative is, that is questionable, and that's something that the church, by and large, through a lot of these very well-known personalities and church leaders that signed on to this, were subscribing to something that was just beginning to be understood and developed, and to use the church as a platform for a government narrative rather than, and using the lens of scripture to say we should therefore just believe the government and its word, rather than allowing a free exchange of ideas and having the ability as individual patients and families and citizens to look at all of the data ourselves. It's really surprising that we didn't know that this was occurring back then and that it did fly under the radar. And was that purposeful? I mean, do you think that there was an intended effort by these churches to just say, here's what we think, and we're using the platform of the church, and we don't want you to know what our engagement, I mean, almost similar to Facebook, that nobody knew until it came out how much Facebook was colluding with the government.
I mean, I think that in a certain sense, maybe they didn't promote this one to the degree that they did these podcasts and interviews, but it feels like the act of signing a public statement was a way, to me, of putting pressure on churches and putting pressure on average Christians in the pews to say, your leaders are aligning with this. This is the respectable position to take. And so I actually think that it was probably the opposite, that they wanted people to feel that pressure and to get in line. Because one of the things when I look at this, you go, well, they went to great efforts to promote Francis Collins, as I said, as a Christian brother. They called him a trusted Christian voice. And what was interesting to me is looking back, when you read this document, they don't name, for example, the great Barrington physicians who, if you're not familiar, they put out a statement also in 2020 saying that they wanted to look at the science a different way. They were the non-consensus scientists. And some of the things that they criticized was the idea of lockdowns. They explored the fact that it was going to have huge economic impact on people, and it was also not necessarily going to be very effective at restraining COVID. And so these scientists from Stanford, Oxford, Harvard, well, so some pretty credible people, you might say, they actually said, listen, what if we just focused our protection on the most vulnerable and didn't shut down all the rest of society? And they also suggested that we're not so sure that masks work. So they put out this statement, this separate statement called the Great Barrington Declaration, where they called for having a real open scientific debate. Now, if you remember at the time, Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci, some emails leaked that showed they didn't want to have a debate. Instead, what they did was call for a swift and devastating takedown of these fringe epidemiologists at Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford. And they asked their friends in the press to discredit them. And so I think that this BioLogos statement was a part of that. It was a part of saying Christians will help discredit these non-consensus, but very credible scientists. And so I think that's part of what was going on. And what really sort of broke my heart when I dug into what happened with this BioLogos statement was I actually went and interviewed one of the authors of the Barrington Declaration, who was one of these non-consensus scientists, a man named Jay Bhattacharya. And he is a medical doctor. He's also a professor of medicine at Stanford. He has 4 degrees from Stanford. One of them is not just 4 degrees, 4 doctorates. And one of them is also in economics. So he's a doctor of medicine. He's also a doctor of economics. So pretty well qualified to talk about the impact of COVID. But what was most fascinating to me was to discover that he is a strong Christian himself. He grew up in India. He was a Hindu. And when he came to the United States and started college at Stanford at 18, he became a Christian. And he has been a member of his church in Silicon Valley for 27 years. He's been an elder and a deacon. So all of this time that they were sort of discrediting Jay Bhattacharya and his colleagues, they were slandering a Christian brother and saying he is non-consensus, he's fringe, he's a conspiracy theorist. And of course, now we look back and we go, oh, well, actually, it turns out that Jay Bhattacharya was right about a lot of things. One of them being that lockdowns have been devastating, that masks didn't really work, and that maybe when we look at the Sweden data, there was a better way to do this than devastating our economy by shutting down the entire world.
Mm-hmm. And, it was so interesting even during all of these contemplations in 2020. I remember a lot of these so-called non-consensus people who were talking about how there are other factors to consider beyond just the medicine or the MD or the Fauci kind of narrative, to say that the only thing that matters is that we get control of this virus. And the only thing that matters is that we have these lockdowns. And he was looking at it through just one angle and data point, rather than a lot of the economists that were viewing things, a lot of the other subject matter areas of people who were concerned about the collateral damage and the collateral consequences. And they were just kind of shoved aside and saying, well, you care about things other than life. You don't, as the Christians would put it, you aren't loving your neighbor. I mean, I even remember local churches in my home state here in Colorado that actually subscribed to this and had, vaccine drives in the lobbies of their own churches with this whole idea and this whole statement of, love your neighbor, get the shot, and used the halls and the lobbies of church to promote the government narrative. And what I find really fascinating about all of this as well, Megan, is that so many on the left always say separation of church and state, and the Christians can never have an opinion, and we can never force our beliefs on anyone. And that would include Christians like you and me. But when it's Christians that go along with the government's narrative, when it's someone like all of these people that signed on to this BioLogos statement, when they are going along with the consensus narrative, when it's someone like Raphael Warnock, who is a pastor out of Georgia, who is pro-choice, and he's right along with the whole CRT and racist narrative. Well, that's fine for him to be a pastor and engaged in politics. But when it's someone who's a genuine Christian who's going, wait a minute, I have questions, or actually want to bring the biblical worldview to this policy consideration or to this science question, then suddenly they claim separation of church and state. So it seems like this consensus was only with pastors that agreed, but then any other Christian who disagreed, then they were pushed out under the non-consensus separation of church and state sort of theory.
Well, you saw that, up close and personal, representing Grace Community Church in California with Pastor John MacArthur. And, my original report back in February, the first time I covered this, one of the elements of that was just how dismissive and really sort of sneering some of these big name pastors, quite frankly, Tim Keller and Rick Warren, were about John MacArthur's choices. So what you saw was not just love your neighbor. This could be a way to search your conscience and decide that the best way to love your neighbor is to wear the masks or get the shot. It was this legalistic binding of consciences saying the only way to see this is that you can only love your neighbor if you do it our way and lock down and get the shot. And I think that was the big issue, is that it was stifling a conversation that should happen. And that was one of the things that when I interviewed Jay Bhattacharya, that he stressed to me was that, look, we need to have a scientific debate. And I think we can have that, and we can bring our faith to bear on that. The problem was they were trying to shut down any sort of debate. And, the other thing that I think about when I look at all this is how this love your neighbor has been used in so many different ways. I mean, we just saw that with Governor Gavin Newsom putting up these billboards saying love your neighbor means supporting abortion. And I mean, your heart just hurts to hear that in the name of Christ. To say support killing babies in the name of Christ hurts. But at the same time, I go, where did he learn that? Where did he learn to abuse the notion of love your neighbor? Well, we saw it for months and months and months during the pandemic. And then, quite frankly, this week, I'm also working on a story on the National Association of Evangelicals has put out a report. Guess what? It's also about loving your neighbor through legislating for fossil fuel regulations. So
oh my gosh.
In this report, they call loving your neighbor lobbying for climate change policy. They actually say it is part of the Great Commission. Now, this is not a fringe group. If you're not familiar with the National Association of Evangelicals, it's very influential. It's in fact where Reagan went in 1983 to give his famous Evil Empire speech. So it's highly influential. It represents some 45,000 American churches. So this is the kind of thing that I go, look, they are trying to take control. The left, when I say they, I mean the left, I mean progressives, are trying to get hold of really sort of the last cultural holdout. You go, what other cultural institution does the left not control right now? I mean, it has Hollywood, it has sports, it has music, it has literally just really everything. The one cultural institution it has not taken hold of is the church. And so to me, there was for a lot of years a hard battle against the church. And now you're seeing the soft incursion. which is if we can't fight you, then what we're going to do is quietly come in and try to transform you. So I think that is what we're seeing now. And to me, that BioLogo statement, that signing on to support specific federal policies of specific federal figures, that's really scary. And I think that is part of this soft incursion of the state trying to use the church for its aims now.
Yeah, that is so well said. And I think you're absolutely right that that there are so many leftists that are trying to then come into the church and take it over and say, even though they don't believe in God, most of the progressive leftists would not call themselves Christians. And yet I find it so ironic that they know better than Christians what God requires of us and what our Bible says and doctrine. Someone like Gavin Newsom, who doesn't proclaim in any way to be part of the Christian faith, he's now using the words of Jesus and manipulating that. And it reminds me of the same way that the Supreme Court and the leftists have proof texted the Constitution. And basically equal protection now is whatever they want it to mean. It's totally detached from the original meaning, the context around it, from the authors, from originalism, from textualism, from any way that you could possibly interpret this in a literal and historical context. They're doing that with biblical text as well. And so when you have someone like Gavin Newsom and all of these leftists and in the midst of COVID saying, well, love your neighbor means this, it's just a way to say, we are going to guilt and shame you that you aren't a good Christian unless you abide by this narrative. And if you even question it, then that means that you're not a faithful parishioner. And that's really dangerous. And I think you're absolutely right that when the left is trying to come in with this soft incursion, we're seeing that even with the LGBT movement. I mean, with a lot of these Catholic churches, evangelical churches, even that are allowing not only women as pastors, which of course is prohibited by the Bible, and that's just one way that they're getting off. But then also having, transgender, these transgender priests and, other members of their ecclesiastical order. And then they're even having these drag queens that are coming in and saying, let's all look and stand and applaud for that. I mean, our good friend Will Witt, I think, put it perfectly on his Instagram comment and said, who else gets that type of stand-up ovation in a church besides Jesus Christ? And now we're doing this for a drag queen. I mean, it's so ridiculous. So you're kind of seeing with this whole expansion of the conversation that it's not just COVID that is being platformed and their narrative of COVID it being platformed in the church. It's really progressive leftism as a whole. They just paved the way for that from, the beginning of the 1960s, really, and beyond, with the sexual revolution, so many other things that the church abdicated, standing firm on the definition of marriage, human sexuality, all of that. That just paved the way to allow for a very easy win for something like this COVID narrative. So where are we going with this? And are there pastors besides, of course, John MacArthur, who you and I both know and love, and he has been steadfast for the truth of the gospel of Christ? Are there pastors that, like Jay that you mentioned as well, that are seeing this and are starting to push back in kind of big Eva?
Well, it's been interesting to go after maybe a year and a half of really kind of diving into this subject. It was discouraging a lot because you saw some very big pastors in some very conservative places. Because I think part of what I want to emphasize is, look, I'm not talking about Sojourners, which, if you're not familiar, is sort of a left-wing progressive, sort of quasi-Christian, but it's more leftist than anything. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about very historically conservative denominations and organizations where we're seeing that. So that's when you really find it a bit scary and a bit jarring. Like, for example, there was a president of the SBC, which is the Southern Baptist Convention, largely recognized as one of the most conservative denominations in the U.S., said a couple of years ago that we should practice something called pronoun hospitality, meaning that if a transgender, this is the term, pronoun hospitality, but, and by that he meant and I interviewed this pastor,
yeah.
And he said, if a transgender person comes into your church, you should use their preferred pronouns as a way of showing hospitality. Now, here's the good news, is I disagreed with him very strongly at the time. And he just very recently, like just in the last few weeks, has come out and said, you know what? I was wrong about that. I should not have advocated that. And that I'm going to take him at his word and believe that that was a sincere mistake. And I'm encouraged to hear that. I'm encouraged to hear some people starting to go, oh gosh, maybe this wasn't the right thing to do. He has also, we've seen other things like I can't remember which Presbyterian denomination it was, because there's a couple of PC denominations and sometimes I get them mixed up. But it was one of the very large Presbyterian denominations has just decided, after 50 years of being members of the National Association of Evangelicals, to leave over this left-wing politicking that the group has done. So that was really encouraging to me, that I'm going, okay, so we are starting to see a separating, that we are starting to see the wheat being separated from the chaff, I think, a little bit. And that is very, I feel very positive about that. Now, that said, I don't think that we turned the corner entirely. And by the way, I want to go back really quickly and say one other thing that I think is positive, because I do love John MacArthur, and I know you do. For a time during COVID, as I said, there was this sort of sneering attitude, and it was just my perception. But what it seemed like to me was that I saw other recognizable names, high profile pastors sort of distancing themselves from Grace Community and from John MacArthur. Well, now that the dust has settled with COVID and we see where everyone stands, it's been very interesting to me to see how that is starting to change, and how just this month we are starting to see Pastor MacArthur at some conferences with some of those big names again, who suddenly seem very willing to share a stage with him again. So I'm really happy to see that as well. And I think that his leadership and his example during COVID speaks for itself. But to get to the negative side now, I don't think that by any means that we've really turned a corner in a strong way. And I think that that is still to come. I was reading a book recently by Grove City professor Paul Kenger called The Devil and Karl Marx. And he's a historian, and he goes into what happened in the 1940s. And I think it offers a lot of lessons for us in our time. And one of the things he said was that the Communist Party very deliberately sent operatives into American churches to use the language of Christianity to sort of baptize communist policies. So it was deliberate. These were atheists. They didn't believe in Jesus, but they pretended to, in order to get into these churches and shift their focus. And Kenger says that the communist operatives at that time called those pastors suckers. They said American pastors were the biggest suckers that they had to deal with. And I go, let's learn from that, and let's not be suckers for the left and for Marxists again. So I thought that was really interesting. So I think we're still in the thick of it, and I hope to do some more reporting on that. But I also don't want to be a Debbie Downer. And I do want to say that, look, part of what we have to do is really talk about these things. I know that it's uncomfortable. I know that it stinks. Let me just tell you, as the person who does it a lot, it stinks to be tagged with the, oh, you're just negative and you're attacking pastors. I don't want to attack pastors. I don't think any of us want to. But we do want our pastors to be faithful, and we do want to be Bereans. And when we hear our pastors saying things that make alarm bells go off, we want to do what the early church did, and we want to go search our scriptures, and we want to test it against the word. And I think when you do that, a lot of what we have seen as far as some of these more progressive organizations and progressive people in the church in the last few years, you're going to find that it doesn't stand up to scripture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it's just so much easier to go along with the narrative and with the cultural demand and the compulsion to just say, okay, especially, for example, something like COVID, to just say, oh, yes, I got vaccinated, I got boosted, I'm doing my part, right? And to be part of this almost what was framed as this great humanitarian effort. And if you're a Christian, you are now loving your neighbor. And it was sort of this feel good kind of thing. And it did take a lot more guts and a lot more flack from a lot of people to stand up to that, to even question it. And, for myself personally, I mean, obviously, representing Pastor MacArthur, and, I'm no stranger to people hating everything that I do. So that was no big deal. But at the same time, I never, and even to this day, have publicly disclosed my vaccination status, which it's been hilarious to see a lot of assumptions on both sides for that, oh, you just don't want to admit that you were vaccinated, or, you just don't want to say that you weren't, because then, people will hate you for that or whatever. I think that it never should have become a measure of public either condemnation or public accreditation and public praise to have something that is a very personal medical decision that I don't believe was necessarily right or wrong at the time, especially when people were just learning information. But the point of what you're saying, I think, is so true, Megan, because for churches who just want to go along with this and say, well, it's easier to be part of the culture and just kind of, instead of pushing upstream and swimming against the tide, they're just going along with it. And so then for people like you and me that in our various fields, which a lot of that overlaps, then we're seen as the dissenters. And I get all the time, why are you calling out your own? And you're just, in-house fighting, and
Yes.
don't call these people out publicly. Well, if I'm not holding people accountable and you're not holding people accountable that are in our own party, how are we ever supposed to hold our political opponents accountable or anyone outside of the Christian faith accountable if we're not even cleaning house within our own worldview system, our own faith system, our own political party? And so to me, it never made sense that we can't and shouldn't call out these public figures, especially in the church, but then also even extended into politics. We're called to do that, not just as Christians, but also as good citizens.
Yeah, and I think if you don't work in media and you're not in that environment, you may not know the pressure being brought to bear on churches from the left. I mean, I can tell you that right now, the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR, PBS, The Atlantic, they are constantly covering church matters, constantly, and they're covering them from the left. I mean, I cannot tell you how many stories just in the last few months about hand-wringing over, Trumpy churches. They're not Trumpy churches. Literally, they have no evidence of that, but they will say, these churches are very Trumpy. And what these churches don't want is they don't want race baiting. They don't want CRT coming in. They don't want division by ethnicity coming into their churches. And so churches that resist that are being painted as, they're just Trumpy. But that is the left discipling churches through the media, and they have been very successful at that. And I think part of the issue that we're seeing is, one, nobody wants to be portrayed negatively with a megaphone as big as the New York Times. So I see pastors who are human, they flinch away from that. So if they get a call from, the star religion reporter, Ruth Graham at the New York Times, to say something negative about Republicans or to even bash the people who come to their church to say, white evangelicals do this or white evangelicals do that. They really like to get those plaudits from, big media. And so I think that's part of what's happening is that those churches, those very well-known figures are being discipled by left-wing media. And part of what I feel like I want to do is go, hey, listen, the people in the pews are actually paying attention to what you're doing, and they don't particularly appreciate being portrayed that way. And they are noticing what's happening here. And so in a way, I sort of feel like that's part of the mission that I have, is to tell the story and represent the point of view of the average people who do not have the ear of the New York Times and who, don't have the Ruth Grahams and the NPR reporters knocking on their door going, well, gosh, Sally Smith, who lives in rural red state, South Carolina, how do you feel about what the leaders of your denomination just told the Washington Post, or something like that? I feel like nobody talks to those people. Nobody represents their point of view. And so that's something that I very much want to do, because so many faithful, unknown Christians across this country are just consistently getting bashed. They're being called racists. They're being called hateful. I think David French had an article where he literally said the most extremist violent threat in the U.S. is coming out of American churches. It was shocking. and that ran in the Atlantic. And so, those are the people that I'm looking to sort of represent with my coverage.
And that's so important, Megan, because there are so many of those people that when they see the constant bashing in the media, they either have to totally turn it off or they feel so alone and isolated. And unless they're part of a very good fellowship that is encouraging them and saying, no, we disagree with that, and you're part of an ecclesia that is actually faithful, then they feel alone and they feel like maybe I'm just the only one. And then that may lend them either to frustration and despair in some ways, or to think, well, maybe, if everybody else is going along with this, maybe I should too. And then they won't be as vocal and bold in their faith, for some of them. And especially some pastors who, like you said, maybe they're saying, well, the only way that I can have a bigger church is to concede some of these things, where the true pastors that don't care about the numbers, they don't care about the celebrity, they're the ones that go unnoticed often because they're the ones that aren't talking to the New York Times and the Washington Post because they have other things to say. And so that is really important for everyone in America who is a faithful Christian to know that there are actually a huge number of us. What, President Trump liked to call the silent majority, I think is very true, not just in the political sphere, but also within the Christian sphere as well, because I know more personally just one-on-one faithful Christians than I do anyone who believes all of this progressive nonsense, but you never see that on mainstream media or, written about. And you're absolutely right. So just in the last 2 minutes I have with you, and thank you so much for this conversation. And I love that I've been able to get to know you personally, and, you're just a wealth of knowledge, and I really applaud what you're doing with your platform, and just encourage you to continue to be bold and speak courageously. And so how can people follow you on Daily Wire and help to get these messages out that you've just so very wisely pointed to, and you always are really such a great reporter. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. And it's really good to be here. That helps. So being on the Jenna Ellis Show really helps get the message out. But you can find me at dailywire.com. My articles are there. And obviously it'd be really helpful if people feel that the information and the reporting in them is helpful. Share them with your pastor, share them with your friends. Get a subscription at Daily Wire if you don't have one. We have lots of great content. And then also you can find me on the Morning Wire podcast several days a week. So Daily Wire now has a podcast. It's not quite as spicy because it's not opinion, it's straight news, but you find that on wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, anywhere else. So I'm on several days a week on Morning Wire. And then you can follow me. I'm trying to get over to Instagram. I know all the cool girls are on Instagram. I have one. I haven't used it. I'm going to change that. But mostly I'm on Twitter. So you can find me at Meg Basham on Twitter.
Okay. Yeah, I was kind of pushed by the Trump campaign to get on Instagram, so I finally did, and I follow a lot of the blogs and the non-political stuff over there, so it's actually kind of a respite from Twitter,
right,
even though I post political content, but you and I are always there. But I also I'm glad that you mentioned the Morning Wire, because I think it's such a great contrast to the kind of NPR sort of newsy, yes, and the Apple podcasts and some of those, because it is just straight reporting. I listen to it actually as many mornings as I can, because it's great content that does not have the leftist liberal bias that pretends to be reporting, but is actually shaped through the lens of, NPR and Apple and all of the mega leftists. And so, for people who, of course, you're listening to this show because you want opinion, but if you also just want straight news that doesn't have that kind of left-leaning bias, Morning Wire is excellent. So love all of you at the Daily Wire, and really appreciate you. So thanks, Megan, and come back anytime, and always love reading your work.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Legacy Precious Metals is the company that I trust to give you good and patient counsel for investing in your retirement. The Biden administration has caused a financial crisis, and they have no clue how to fix it. Oil prices have skyrocketed, and when oil prices go up, not only do your expenses go up, but the cost of transportation and shipping spikes, leading the prices of goods to rise. And and we are already seeing record inflation. That's the last thing that we need. Our economy is in trouble, and you need to take steps to protect yourself. If all your money is tied up in stocks, bonds, and traditional markets, you may be vulnerable. So gold is one of the very best ways to protect your retirement. No matter what happens, you own your own gold. It's real, it's physical, and it's always been valuable since the dawn of time. Call Legacy Precious Metals today at 866-528-1903 or visit them online at legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com, where you can download the free investor's guide. You can also go to my Facebook page, Jenna Ellis. I am a public figure on Facebook, and I just posted yesterday a really great interview with the president of Legacy Precious Metals, who is discussing why you need to start your retirement account even if you're in your 20s or 30s. There is always a great time to protect your retirement and invest, just like you want to protect your health over the long term. So go to Legacy Precious Metals at legacypminvestments.com or call 866-528-1903.
MyPillow is having their biggest sheet sale of the year. You all have helped build MyPillow into the amazing company that it is today. Now, Mike Lindell, the inventor and CEO, wants to give back exclusively to you, his listeners. The Percale bed sheet set is available in a variety of colors and sizes, and they are all on sale. So, for example, the queen size is regularly priced at $89.98, but is now only $39.98 with our listener promo code Jenna, Jenna. So order now, because when they're gone, they're gone. The Percale bed sheets are breathable and have a cool and crisp feel. These come with a 10-year warranty and a 60-day money-back guarantee, so don't miss out on this incredible offer. There's a limited supply, so be sure to order now. You can call 1-800-564-8475 and use the promo code Jenna, or go to mypillow.com/Jenna. You can click on the radio listeners square and use the promo code Jenna. That's Jenna. Thank you so much to all of Mike Lindell's listeners and listeners of this podcast for making sure to support MyPillow and using our exclusive listener promo code Jenna. That's Jenna.